And then, then there was a Sister Joseph from the Poor Clare Nuns. Father McNamara was asked if he would, first of all, Cardinal Cody, I told you this story, where the Poor Clare Nuns their convent was very, very old, and it had to be torn down. It was irreparable. The furnaces were going out and all that. And so Cardinal Cody said it's just got to be torn down. And they called and asked what should they do with their saints. They had Saint Hyacinth, whom I often visited, and he was in a crypt, and Saint Maximina, which they used to only bring her out like once a year.
You had two bodies?
One of Saint Hyacinth and one of Saint Maximina. And then they had their own nuns buried out in a cemetery where their nuns were buried. So they called Cardinal Cody and said, what shall we do with the saints and with our nuns? And he said, just bury them, leave them in the ground. Well, they knew that they didn't want this, so someone asked Father McNamara, would he like to have St. Maximina? And he said, I'll be delighted. He said, I'll have her for my secretary. So he went and called an undertaker friend of his after he had arrived over there, and he said, I have something, can you bring your hearse over here and pick it up for me? And they said yes. In the meantime, Father said to this Sister Joseph, he said, now I have to have the relic papers, the papers that go with this to prove it's a first-class relic. And she said, Father, would you look down at these, she was Irish, and she said, would you look down at these awful feet that I have? And the relics were up on the third floor. And she said, now, Father Mac, you wouldn't expect me to walk all the way up to the third floor, would you now, and pick up those papers? And he said, yes, I would, my dear. He said, and by the time you come down, he said, your feet will no longer be bothering you. When that nun, after traveling all up to the third floor, came down, her feet were miraculously cured. She wrote a letter to Father McNamara thanking him for this great miracle. And when he did get St. Maximina then, but I'll finish the story about that. When the hearse came, it wasn't big enough to put this crypt that St. Maximina was in. So Father McNamara, yeah. I'll bring that statue. And I have many, many miracles that happened through St. Maximina. But so Father thought, well, what are we going to do? So he called a friend of mine whose brother frequented the taverns with his buddies, and maybe just only for a couple of beers or whatever. So he asked, would you get a hold of Joe and see if he could get a couple of guys to come over and help me out? I need to remove something from the Poor Clares, and it would have to get into a truck, an open truck. And so Catherine called her brother, and these fellows went over there, and they had evidently a few drinks at the bar. And it was covered with tarpaulin when they took it out of the Poor Clare's convent. And by the time they got to the rectory, Father had hoped that she would be enshrined in the church, but the pastor wouldn't allow it. So Father had to bring her in and put her into this, behind the sacristy where his little office was. He had some cabinets that were steady and solid, so her crypt was placed on the cabinets. But the men had to take the door hinges off in order to get in. So with all the shuffling of trying to get this crypt in, the tarpaulin fell off, and the guys saw here was this corpse in there. And they said, oh, merciful God, we'll never take another drop of drink again.